welcome to the 21st Century Renaissance Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Michael Lopiano, and I am joined today by my lovely and talented partner in crime, Oksana Hryvinska.
Hello.
Hello. Yes. Today we're going to spend some time introducing the podcast, sort of mapping out the goals of this program, right? How it's going to work, what you can expect from these episodes, and learning a bit about really what the 21st Century Renaissance is all about. So first and foremost, this podcast is going to be structured around having sincere, creative, and exploratory dialogue with guests. It will not be scripted. There will not be sort of determined results. The topics will not, the topics will sort of emerge as we bring guests onto the show, but it's not going to be sort of a lecture form podcast or anything like that. The emphasis will be on exploratory dialogue. So to demonstrate a bit of what that's going to look like, Oksana has agreed to help me out here and interview me to demonstrate what this kind of exploratory dialogue looks like as we map out some of the details of the podcast.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning. You've named your podcast as the 21st Century Renaissance. Maybe you could tell us, what is this?
So what is the 21st Century Renaissance? Yeah, so there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, chatter, right? A lot of people out there right now are saying, hey, there are these problems going on in the West, right? We have this thing, especially in the United States, maybe in Britain, but in Western society at large, right? We have this idea of culture war. We hear culture war everywhere. We hear, our institutions are decaying, and there's, corruption, or maybe, a lack of substance in a lot of our educational systems, something like that. And that what we really need is a Renaissance 2.0. That's something we need. That's something that Western society needs, right? This idea that, right, once upon a time, during the Middle Ages, there were all these similar institutional crises, and it was resolved, or these problems were resolved by means of the Renaissance, right? Capital R, Renaissance, something like that. And but really, right, so I've spent a considerable portion of my life studying the Renaissance, right? My PhD in particular is in, it's a combined PhD, but in history and Renaissance studies. So I've spent now, sort of minimum 10 years studying the Renaissance. And really, based on that experience, based on that time spent studying and publishing and researching and teaching and such, I came to the understanding, it's my hypothesis, right? I mean, I don't know for certain that's part of what this project is about, that really there's a Renaissance 2.0, as it were, that's going on already. Okay. And I've called that the 21st Century Renaissance, right? Okay, I think in part that this sort of cultural renaissance, or this rearticulation, let's say, or revival of maybe some of the spirit of sort of cultural verve or liveliness, that a lot of this has sort of been cooking in the background over the past few decades in our institutions, in our culture, in intellectual spheres, in artistic spheres. And I think really, especially now with the growth of new technologies like, how integrated we are now with the internet, social media platforms, things like this, that really this is the culmination. What we're in the midst of now is a Renaissance phenomenon. It's happening right now, and we have just to realize it in order to be a part of it.
How did you arrive at this conclusion exactly?
Well, a part of that was the time that I spent studying the Renaissance and the late medieval European history, and really I noticed some parallels between some of the broad patterns of the Renaissance. So, for example, in the 14th century, there were a number of crises that well, that let's call it the Latin West, right? So culturally, the lands of the former western half of the Roman Empire, right? Culturally Latin speaking, writing in Latin language, right? The Latin liturgy of the church. This portion of Western culture was facing some ambient crises that maybe in terms of similarity or pattern look a lot like ours, right? I would say that perhaps a lot of our problems today, the crises we face or the perceived crises we face are differ in scale, but not necessarily in underlying form in relation to society. So I'll explain what I mean. I'll mention what I mean here, right? One of the main crises, of course, that seems to come across all different areas of the news and media and whatnot is environmental crisis, right? This idea that the climate crisis in particular is one that gets pointed to a lot, but perhaps beyond that, there is also an idea that human beings are somehow overtaxing Earth's natural resources.
Yeah.
And this is a real, right? This is a real problem. We've developed our society to this point where we have to ask ourselves questions about, okay, how do we move forward as a society in a way that doesn't, accidentally overtax the earth and then lead us into destruction, something like that, because we've, developed this ability to harness resources in a particular way that we weren't able to before. Okay, that was, and this may come as a surprise to many people, but we also did that, or I should say, Western society also did that in the 13th and 14th centuries. This period in time was, a height of, population growth in Europe, right? The European continent was sustaining a population probably around 1,300 of low estimates are around 80 to 85 million people, with upper estimates maybe closer to about 100 or even 110 million people. And what happened, this was Europe's basically most prosperous period, right? It was kind of self-sustaining in certain ways. It was connected to Eastern commerce, right? There was a lot of prosperity, return of mercantile wealth, right? This is the burgeoning of the Italian cities, Italian trade republics. Agriculture, right, had been brought to its greatest extent on the European continent, and part of what occurred was an overtaxing of the land. Through a phenomenon known as défrichement, a French term that French social historians use. Right, what the European population did in order to sustain this many people was spread outward. Right, there needed to be new farmland. What happened was a large clearing of the native forests of Europe, and the cultivation of what is often referred to as marginal land that's not particularly agriculturally rich. I mean, European soil in general, right? It's not, we think today, what a bountiful place, but that's a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. Europe historically is not a very bountiful place. That's not, when you think ideal farmland, you think like a frequently flooding river plain, not mountains, forests, rocky soil like Europe is. So what the medieval Europeans did to get this to work, get their population to grow was, right, they cleared vast tracts of forest and started cultivating marginal land. So land that was not terribly high quality, but in the particular environmental conditions, the medieval warm period it's usually called, this enabled a sizable portion of the population to expand, to sustain themselves. They didn't have much surplus, but provided that environmental conditions were good, you could live on this land. You could live on this land. This changed, for example, in 1317, right? The 14th century was a time where a period of global cooling began to set in that didn't really round out until about, or bottom out, I should say, around the 17th century, right? The Earth is always going through these sort of climatological epicycles, yeah. And this resulted, right? This resulted in a great famine. Perhaps as much as 20% of the European population died in these early years of the 14th century. So this is even before the Black Death. Although the
when was the crisis? in the 13th.
This was in the 14th century, right? This is the beginning of it. This is the beginning of it. Right. So similar problems, right? I'm mentioning this not necessarily to give a lecture on the late Middle Ages or anything like that, but to demonstrate, right? There are some formal problems here that individuals were thinking about, right? And part of the way that Renaissance individuals responded to these problems, environmental problems, yes, perhaps institutional problems as well. Many were unhappy with the state of education, unhappy with the state of government, unhappy with the institutional church, unhappy with conflicts between rulers of the Latin West, right? Thinkers such as Francesco Petrarca, so Petrarch, thought, well, what we really need to do is we need to, in order to improve these problems we're experiencing with prosperity, we need to, say, reform the education system, and we need to cultivate, sort of rediscover our traditions and the classical past, and right, not necessarily create new culture, but reform and sort of tidy up and sort of make stable and integral again the culture that we do have, something like that. So, through a bit of investigation of the world as it is now, I started to see parallels kind of emerge
patterns
through this. Yeah, does that make sense?
Okay, interesting, but I struggle to understand how is it all connected, the climatological challenges, the educational challenges, all of this.
Yeah, so there are a number of thinkers in our current, I guess in the current state of the world, who see perhaps a psychological or cultural root underlying a number of these sorts of problems. Very recently, right, individuals such as Ian McGilchrist, Jonathan Vervaeke, Daniel Schmachtenberger had this a roundtable sort of based off of these ideas. Jordan Peterson, someone else who kind of talks about this, as there being a sort of psychological root to many of these issues, and that in order to confront some of these problems, it involves a kind of cultural organization, an organization of the human resources that we do have, which, wow, oh my gosh, the current human resources that we do have, right, we're approaching 9 billion people, whereas, okay, if we're thinking about, well, on the planet, right, but even if you say, okay, if you can recruit half of those people, right, well, we live in a global society now, so you can recruit, a lot of these people. You're talking about that versus a medieval European society where, okay, you've got 80 million people with the population starkly declining down to maybe 40 or 45 million people as a result of the Black Death and these famines. Right, the idea is, well, it's not necessarily like these larger scale problems or these sort of ambient crises, maybe they're linked to some sort of meta issue of how to organize ourselves in such a way that it reflects sustainability. It reflects a proper relationship with other members of society. It helps the individual not feel alienated from broader culture. It helps the individual understand his or her place in relationship to, sustainability questions, right? How are we engaging with the earth in a way that is both meaningful, contributes to prosperity, but does not, in the long run, contribute to there being some kind of greater problem of overexploitation of resources, right? That maybe these sorts of questions come down to a question of how are we placing ourselves through, or how are, not necessarily placing, but how are we imagining ourselves? How are we educating our imagination? How are we educating ourselves to understand our place in relationship to the world? And right, of course, the structure that does that is culture, and education, a way of building that, right? Or of re-articulating that, of reinforcing that, of delivering that in a representable, articulatable form to people at large, something like that. So those sorts of questions were asked by individuals such as Renaissance humanists, the fundamental underpinning of the Renaissance was indeed an educational movement, right? We tend to think about the Renaissance as being about, oh, it's about art, or, you know, just kind of this display of things that look nice, or let's make architecture look nice. Sure, yes, but these are the consequences of what is at heart an educational movement, a reform of education, sort of a dissatisfaction with kind of the legalism, the overly utilitarian almost approach to education in the medieval universities, and a sincere desire among a large section of the population, right? People, Renaissance humanists like Petrarch, thinking alternatively to these structures. How could we reshape these institutions, such as the universities, such as the church? How could we create some sort of schooling environment that would help us re-articulate culture in a meaningful way that might help us resolve some of these issues, if not all of them?
All right, so tell us this. What is it that you are trying to do with this podcast? What are you aiming at with the 21st Century Renaissance podcast?
Yeah, so the podcast, right? Okay, so here's first off what I'm not trying to do, right? A lot of what we hear from people is, hey, look, follow me, listen to my podcast while I go and, you know, start the revolution that changes the world and saves it, right? That's different from what I see. I see that many people, right, this is happening at a broadly distributed level. Many people on a small scale, or from a smaller scale to a larger scale, are already doing this. And in fact, the Renaissance itself operated that way, right? We don't look back on the Renaissance and go, yes, that one Renaissance guy who was the Messiah who saved all of European civilization in the 15th century, right? There isn't anybody like that. That's not right. The Renaissance was this distributed phenomenon of people at sort of small local levels engaging in, right, cultural revivification. Maybe it's the founding of a school. Maybe it's trying to experiment and innovate, for example, with the printing press, right? Renaissance thinkers, the Renaissance humanists in particular, these sort of educational reformers, were the first ones to patronize the printing press. They saw this immense potential to be able to use print technology to make education, to make information, classical literacy, character education, moral reform, more broadly accessible in a way that nobody ever could, right? Because books used to be.
That was their first podcast.
Well, exactly, right? So really, what I see going on here is that there are people all over the world right now who are engaged in this kind of activity on a local level, right, at various scales. And so my objective with this podcast, okay, first, it's to investigate this hypothesis that the 21st century Renaissance is going on, right? I'm not standing up here and saying, it definitely is, right? Here's my argument, you believe me, and if you don't, get out, right? That's not what I'm saying. It's, I think this is going on. I have this intuition, which is generated from many years of studying the Renaissance historically as an historical phenomenon, and then looking out into the world right now and trying to make sense of what's going on. So a part of what I'm trying to do is investigate that. Is that really what's going on? So part of what the podcast will be is sort of asking questions of people who I think are engaging in this kind of innovation, creative exploration, cultural revivification, something like that, to indeed see if there are these kind of parallels between these two phenomena. This 21st century Renaissance, as I've termed it, and the historical Renaissance that took place in, say, the 15th, 16th century in Europe. Okay, so that's one objective. The other objective is to encourage individuals throughout the world to engage in this type of work themselves, right? I particularly find this exploratory investigation, I find, I've found a lot of fulfillment working on creative projects and kind of going out on my own. Something I'm trying to do, right, is continue to engage in this type of investigation and exploration myself in a sort of self-supporting, distributed way. And you've been a major inspiration to me in that regard, since, right, you do that with your own business, right? You do that with your exploration of health and applied neurology and such, right? So that's been a major inspiration to me, and I found a lot of fulfillment in aiming for that experience of having a life that is guided by that kind of exploratory, creative, playful spirit, versus one that is motivated by stress, anxiety, fear. What if this goes wrong? What if that goes wrong? I need to the career has to look like this, and I have to have this position at this time, or my life's a mess, or something, right? I think that cultural revivification in all of its forms, when it is acted out in the context of that spirit, is fundamentally a force for good in the world. And if through this podcast I can help connect people who are engaged in that behavior, in that activity with one another, who have that spirit inhabit them, that fundamentally I see that as a transformative force for good in the world.
Yeah. That will drive the Renaissance. The
exactly.
second edition.
Yeah, exactly. I hope there are people too, who will listen to this podcast, maybe who are thinking about like, well, I'd love to have a creative project. Let's say, in the area of, I had this sort of educational game that I always wanted to make, but I don't really know how to do that, and I don't know how to support it and get the infrastructure and do all this. So, I'm just gonna leave it on the back burner and just leave it a dream. We'll have someone on the show actually, right, who's working on exactly that, right? And so maybe someone can come on and go, hey, wow, look, I can learn from this guy. He's been doing this for 10 years.
Get inspired.
Right, they can get inspired. They can have a sort of guide or a template to help them make a little bit more progress or have some direction to go in if they're trying to engage in that kind of innovative, creative, exploratory work themselves. So that's what my aim is for the show.
Very good. Okay, it sounds really good. I really wish you all the best with this endeavor. I would typically finish this video with the invitation for your people to subscribe this channel.
Yeah. Well, I'll take some advice from the professional here. So
leave a comment. Maybe you have some ideas, right, for a podcast, or some people.
Yeah.
To see on the podcast.
Well, yeah. So we'll have our first guest on next Friday. Right. So we'll drop new episodes on Fridays. And be sure to like, subscribe. We're gonna have full video casted episodes that are available on YouTube. You can also find audio recordings for when you want to go for a walk or a drive or whatnot on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And looking forward to seeing you guys there. You can follow along with the project on Instagram, on Twitter as well. So thanks very much. Looking forward to having you along for the ride. Let's see what we can discover. Thanks very much.